Delighted so many of you are here this evening. We're discussing a very topical question this evening. Should we legislate to permit assisted dying? Obviously a subject which arouses great emotions and feelings for perfectly understandable reasons, but we've assembled a panel which I hope will be able to elucidate and discuss the issues in a very positive and helpful way. One of the things that we've done for this programme is to commission research by YouGov about public attitudes and attitudes within the faiths to the subject under discussion. And so we're going to kick off, as we have in the previous series, by asking Professor Linda Woodhead to introduce the research that's been done on this and explain it so that it gives a background to the general discussion that we will have. So, Linda.
Charles. So this is the question that we're going to be discussing tonight. Sorry, I don't want to insult your intelligence, but these terms, just to make for clarity of discussion, there are a variety of terms that are being used at the moment. Euthanasia is the more traditional one. It just means a good death. Assisted suicide, helping someone to commit suicide for whatever reason they might want to do that. Assisted dying implies that the person has a terminal illness, that they are in the process of dying anyway, so they're being helped along a natural course. So something more stringent than assisted suicide. Sometimes people also want to add the word voluntary to these terms. Obviously, if they're involuntary, it's murder. And another distinction that can be useful is between physician-assisted forms of euthanasia. There are various ways, various forms of the assistedness of assisted suicide, assisted dying. This may come into our debate later on. This was a question that we asked on the poll that Charles mentioned, which YouGov administered for us to support this debate, because we're interested in this debate in reporting on the current range of religious and secular attitudes to the range of ethical topics we've been looking at. There is no one standard question. It's a tricky one to ask on a survey. The way we've asked it, I've put it up here for you so you can see exactly what was involved. And you can see that here we were talking about assisted dying. So the question was about assisted dying, people with incurable diseases. Can they have friends or relatives, so not physician-assisted, friends or relatives, to help them without risking prosecution? This is a standard survey item that YouGov have used for several years, and we replicated it. The finding was this from the research we did this January. A very, very strong majority of people wanting the law to be changed. We also looked specifically in our survey at religious people. By adherents, that just means people who, when they're asked, they identify as being Anglican or Catholic or Buddhist or whatever, but not as no religion. They also, surprisingly, a significant margin there, also supporting a change in the law amongst religious people in Great Britain as a whole, adults in Great Britain as a whole. I'm sorry that's a bit small at the top, but I wanted to get all the religions in. You can see there is some variation between the different religious traditions. This is all up on our website for you to look at in more detail. But nevertheless, fairly strong support throughout for a change in the law, not amongst Muslims, not amongst Baptists. They're the exceptions. So Muslims on this column here and Baptists here. It's very, very high support amongst Anglicans. More Anglicans than the general population want to see a change in the law. 72% of Anglicans, it was 70% of the general population. And Catholics, quite significantly, quite a significant margin in favour there, 56% in favour, 30% against. So these are adherents. If you think, well, people who go to church or the mosque or are really actively practicing may be significantly different, we asked about that as well. They are a bit more opposed, but you can see it's pretty evenly weighted for many of them. Anglicans are still very strongly, church-going Anglicans still 59% support change, 25% oppose. Catholics fairly evenly balanced between for and against amongst mass-going Catholics. Muslims very strongly opposed. Baptists are as well, although we didn't separate them in that question from the Methodists. We asked also about reasons, so we're very interested in why people are saying that they want a change in the law or that they don't want a change in the law. So the way the poll worked, first of all, we just asked, do you want to change, yes or no? And then if you said that you did want to change, what were your reasons? And astonishing support for that first reason. As you can see, they aren't exclusive. You can tick as many as you like. But 82% of people saying their reason for thinking the law should be changed is that an individual has the right to choose when and how to die. And then a worry about drawn-out suffering is the next largest. But very significant consensus in attitudes, reasoning there. And amongst those who don't want to see a change in the law, don't want to see it becoming more permissive, less consensus about the reasons here. And interestingly, the reason that campaigners often talk about, particularly religious ones, human life is sacred, comes only fourth in the reasons. The most significant worry is that vulnerable people could feel pressurized or be pressurized to die. There is a bit of time series data from some polls. The British Social Attitudes Survey has looked over time. You can see that opinion has been growing slowly, but it's been high for some time. But notice the question here, because I'm going to show you another question, and you'll see that people respond quite differently to variations in the question. So this one is about, this is quite stringent. The person's got to have a painful and incurable disease. And then it's asking about physician-assisted. People are strongly in favour of allowing that. Now, change the question, painful and incurable, but they're not going to die. For example, severe arthritis. And that completely changes people's views about it. So assisted dying, but not assisted suicide seems to be the case. And here's a significant one. ComRes last year looked at the people who count if the legislation is going to be changed, some of the people who count, the MPs, and you can see there that that's very different from those general population attitudes that I began with. The majority of MPs in Conservative and Labour parties are opposed to legalising assisted suicide, whereas Lib Dems are in favour, but overall very significantly opposed by members of Parliament a change.
I'll introduce the panel one by one. As usual, I'm going to ask everybody to answer for about 5 minutes the question, should we legislate to permit assisted dying, in whatever way they'd like to do that. I will then chair a conversation between the panel for about another 20 minutes or so about the questions that we've been discussed. And then, as in the past, I will throw it open to the floor for your questions and comments, and hopefully we can elaborate the discussion that way. Our first contributor is Charlie Falconer, Labour peer. He was Lord Chancellor. He's a very experienced lawyer, very engaged in this whole debate about the place of law in regulating the morals of our society and how it operates. He's taken a strong view on this, having chaired the Commission on Assisted Dying, and he has been proposing legislation for Parliament to consider on this issue. He's been a close colleague of mine over the years. I'm delighted, Charlie, you've been able to come along this evening. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Charles. I support legislating to allow assisted dying. Linda gave very clear definitions, and of what is meant by assisted dying, both in Linda's book and in my book, is that means assisting somebody to take their own life, but in the context of a terminal illness. I am motivated to support this by my experience of seeing how people die and listening to people explaining what their experience of the death of a loved one has been. If you are ill, if that illness is almost certainly going to lead to your death, maybe in 5 days, maybe in 2 months, maybe in 3 months, should you fight for every minute? Should you be forced to keep on going when society has basically said we don't outlaw suicide? We as a society should do our best to stop people normally trying to commit suicide. But where your life is about to end, and where you fear maybe the loss of control, or maybe the life that you are leading is absolutely awful, is it wrong to have a situation where a doctor can give you a prescription that will allow you to take your own life? In my view, it is not. It is the compassionate and right thing to do. And society, in a way, has reached that conclusion on its own. We have a law at the moment that says it's a criminal offence to assist somebody else to kill themselves, and the maximum sentence for such a crime is 14 years. But what the police and the prosecutors are constantly faced with is people who, with the best possible motive, because they feel compassion towards those that they love who are dying, assist them to take their own life. And the most common way that's happening at the moment is that people go to Switzerland, where it's lawful to take your own life. They help them by taking them to the airport, accompany them when they go. The prosecuting authorities know that's a crime. It's assisting somebody to kill themselves, but they just do not have the stomach to prosecute them because they believe they're acting with compassion and it's helping somebody in the context of a very, very difficult situation. So the Director of Public Prosecutions, the person who decides whether you're prosecuted or not, has issued guidelines which say, in effect, I won't prosecute people if they're motivated by compassion. But these guidelines make it clear that he would prosecute a doctor if he assisted somebody to commit suicide. So you have this ridiculous, hypocritical law which says amateur assistance in this country is allowed, but professional assistance is not. It is a ridiculous denial of the facts. Can you introduce a law, or do you have to depend upon the discretion of the Director of Public Prosecutions? I think you can introduce a law. I think you can introduce a law that says 2 doctors have got to be satisfied that you are terminally ill, you have a specified period of time to live in their opinion, and there's no reason why you shouldn't be assisted to die. It's happened in other countries. It's happened, for example, in Oregon. And in Oregon, it's worked incredibly well without any damage to palliative care. Indeed, palliative care has improved. I think it's time for us as a society to catch up in our law with what people are already doing. People in the context of a terminal illness should have the right to choose how they die. I don't think anybody should kill them. I think they've got to kill themselves. But it's their right. And I think we're not compassionate as a society if our law doesn't change to catch up with the practice. Thank you very much indeed.
Charlie, thank you very much for that. That was really tremendously clear. Very much appreciated. Our second contributor is Professor Rob George, who's Professor of Palliative Care at the Cicely Saunders Institute. Rob George pioneered HIV and non-cancer palliative care at University College Hospital and its community, during which time he was part of a number of health service research projects with the team at the Cicely Saunders Institute. He's now responsible at Guy's and St Thomas's in London for community palliative and end-of-life care. He leads end-of-life care for London, advises government and sits on various ethics committees. His overarching academic interests are, quotes, to understand the nature of suffering across different cultures, their response and the complexities that this introduces to care and service delivery. Rob, thank you very much for coming this evening. We're very much looking forward to what you have to say.
Thank you, Charles. I'm coming at this really as a jobbing clinician. I was out with patients this afternoon. I've come from work. That's what I do every day, look after people who are dying. Probably about 20,000, I guess, over my professional career. And the interesting thing is that if you ask society in general about their views, you essentially get a report much as the YouGov report. If you ask clinicians, the numbers are reversed. Why is that? So about 70% of doctors are firmly against assisting suicide. And I think there are probably 2 or 3 reasons, but I'm just going to deal with one principal one. And that is that we know how complex and difficult and subtle is managing somebody as they engage and struggle with the issues around death and dying. We know also that whilst we're not perfect at it, there is a great deal that can be done. So, for example, a gentleman I saw today, severely disabled with a neurodisability, nervous system disability. Most people observing him would say he had unbearable suffering. If you actually ask him, that's not the case at all. So through my eyes, were I not to be informed, then I would be inclined to think that. And I think that for many of us in society, to observe these situations is exceptionally difficult. It's what we call the burden of witness. And an example from my personal life was when my father was dying from dementia, and my mother said, I can't bear all of this suffering. And I said, Mother, why don't we just ask him? So I asked him, and he said, don't be ridiculous, I'm not suffering at all. So I said, Mummy's just said he's not suffering. She said, yes, but I just can't bear seeing all this suffering. She was speaking about herself. And for many of us who work in these areas, it is a difficult time managing suffering. But that's what the human condition is about, and that's what society is about, is helping people to transcend. And there are many people in society who have dreadful disabilities and all sorts of challenges who do transcend. And I wish we would look at finding out how they deal with it and looking at how we can help people who can't cope with it to learn and to develop and to change in those ways, because we will never take suffering away. And the problem is that if you say, introducing medicine, that doctors should be involved in this, you've effectively reclassified ending a life, killing to be blunt, as being a potential good. And once that happens, you've changed its category in society. You've turned it from a freedom to kill yourself into an entitlement to be killed. Because, do you know, there's no difference morally between giving someone a prescription for antibiotics and injecting them with intravenous antibiotics. The moral decision is they needed antibiotics. So this idea that somehow there's a difference between assisted dying or assisted suicide and completing the job is a purely, I think, confused position. We are not in a position, once we've said that this is an acceptable thing to do, to prevent people who can mount a case in favour of their having their lives ended doing it. And if doctors are involved, it becomes a duty of care. We are obliged to do that. And if we're obliged as part of our duty of care to do something, then do you know what? It becomes subject to all the constraints, pressures and difficulties of staying within budgets and providing care with limited resources and all sorts of other things. So that's why introducing something like this is a change in climate. It is a game changer. And in actual fact, doctors don't know how to kill people. We're not trained to do that. We'd have to start treating medicine in a different kind of way. That brings me to the final point I want to make in this opener. And that is I think there's an absolute moral reason why this is wrong. And that is, I believe it is wrong fundamentally to require somebody else to kill you in your own best interests. Why? Because it is a moral hazard to you, the person doing it. And I do not have an entitlement under autonomy or any other moral code to actually say you are required to do that because I want you to. And in a sense, the question, therefore, that we've got to ask ourselves is, what's worse? Is it not to kill people who might want to die, or to kill people who might want to live? Because once society allows this, it will then change the ambient culture, and it will start to introduce obligations and duties. And in fact, the data from Oregon demonstrates that. There's something like a 5-fold rise, you can get it off the website, of people saying they want their life ended because they consider themselves to be a burden on the family. Whether that's real or perceived is irrelevant. It has become an increasing reason why people feel that they ought or they want to have their life ended.
Rob, thank you very much again. Tremendously clear. You've set it out in a way that people really can identify with. Our third speaker is Rev Dr Jones Fraser, who is priest in charge of St Mary's, Newington, in South London. He rose to prominence when he was at St Paul's, when Occupy London set up camp in St Paul's Cathedral, where he was the Canon Chancellor. At that time, he resigned in opposition to the cathedral authorities' plan to use force to evict the Occupy protesters. He writes the column Loose Cannon. That's a very clever joke, by the way, C-A-N-O-N, as opposed to C-A-N-N-O-N, for the Guardian newspaper, and is also a regular contributor to BBC Radio 4's Thought for the Day and the Church Times. He's a substantial public commentator on these matters. Giles, we're very grateful to you for coming along this evening. Thank you very much. Giles Fraser.
Thank you. People often say they don't want to be a burden to their families. Well, I bloody well do want to be a burden to my family, and actually I want my family to be a burden to me. And that seems to me to be entirely what it is to be in a family and in a community. My problem with the way in which this debate is framed is not the conclusion. I think perhaps, probably, Charlie Falconer will have his way. The opinion polls seem to go that way, and I suspect that'll happen. And I'm not going to beat myself up and think that's the worst thing in the world. But there is a broader issue here which really does concern me. And the issue is something about the way in which the sort of individualism that we have in our society is now beginning to infect even the way that we think about death. If you ask people how they want to die, the majority of people say they want to die painlessly, quickly, in their sleep, without being a bother, without being a burden to other people. They almost want to die without knowing they're dying, or without anybody else knowing they're dying. Dying is so much less a public phenomenon now than it used to be. But it's, in 100 years' time, everybody in this room will be food for daffodils. And the important thing about recognising death and recognising our vulnerability is that is an absolute part of what makes us human. And that acceptance of that acceptance of our suffering, of our loss, of our vulnerability, is a crucial part of how we care for each other. This business about an individual has the right to choose, I think the origins of that are probably in market capitalism, and it's an ethics which originates in probably something as fundamentally inane as choosing cornflakes in the supermarket. I have to choose. I have a right to choose. Choice is the ultimate moral value. I think that is fundamentally rooted in capitalism and the way in which capitalism has changed our moral values. I want to talk not about the individual's right to choose. I want to talk about communities and the way in which communities look after each other. And so for me, things like right to choose, self-determination, even things like suffering are not the trump card. There's a really great question that the philosopher, this raises the frame, opens the frame a bit, but there's a really great question the philosopher Martha Nussbaum asks, and she says, why do gods in ancient Greek literature fall in love with human beings? Gods are perfect, they can never die, nothing ever goes wrong with them, they're absolutely, completely pristine. Why would gods, and it happens quite a lot, fall in love with messy, vulnerable human beings that decay and produce waste and fail and things like that, because there's so much about human beings and why we're important that's bound up with our vulnerabilities. Courage, love, care for others. That is not done in a world where everybody's immune from pain and loss. And I think the way in which we try and anaesthetize ourselves from pain and loss and suffering ultimately has a detrimental effect on our relationships with each other. You're feeling a bit miserable, take a pill for that. Takes off the highs, but it takes off the lows. All we're trying to do is anaesthetize our suffering. And actually, I think one of the problems from that is we actually limit ourselves from each other. Yes, I want to be a burden to my family, and I want them to be a burden on me, and I want to care for them, and I hope they care for me. Thank you very much.
Again, Giles, very, very powerful. Thank you very, very much indeed for that contribution. Our final panellist is Baroness Ilora Finley, who was elevated to the peerage in the crossbenches in 2001. Actively involved in Parliament in debates on health issues, she served on the Select Committee on the Assisted Dying for the Terminally Ill Bill. She's been at the heart of these debates. Her academic expertise is in palliative care, and she's helped establish Cardiff University as a world-ranking centre in the field. She was the first consultant in palliative medicine in Wales in 1987 and has developed palliative and hospice services across Wales. She's worked with Marie Curie Cancer Care since 1987, and she's now a National Vice President of that charity. She remains an active clinician, teacher and academic, as well as her involvement in Parliament. She's co-chair of Living and Dying Well, a think tank which is seeking to examine the evidence against euthanasia and assisted suicide, around euthanasia and assisted suicide. Ilora, thanks very much for coming this evening. We very much look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Charlie. Charlie. Yes. You're Charlie. I beg your pardon.
We have a battle about Charles and Charlie.
I beg your pardon.
Privately, I'm Charles and he's Charlie.
Fine,
but occasionally he tries to be a Charles, but it doesn't.
I'm very sorry, and I apologise, because we had a really interesting discussion out there beforehand. The problem that we're facing here is that what you, Charlie, want to do is to license doctors to prescribe lethal overdoses for their patients, effectively on request. And you talk about safeguards, and you say that the law currently isn't working. And I would like to challenge both of those presumptions. Firstly, is the law working? Well, there are clear guidance over prosecution that's been developed by Keir Starmer, and there has been no argument about those who have not been prosecuted. And why? Because we have laws which are there to protect people in society who are vulnerable. When those laws are broken, our framework interprets compassionately what happened, what is the evidence, is there a danger to society, and will prosecute if there is. But if there is not, they are not prosecuted. But we do not change the law ahead of an event. Take a mother who steals because her children are hungry, and sadly, we have more hungry children today than we've had for a long time. We would not expect that mother to be prosecuted.
Yes, we would.
No, we would not. We would expect the DPP to look at this and look compassionately on the situation, but we don't have a law, and we're not proposing a law to put extenuating circumstances around what you do ahead of an event. If you look at Oregon, which you're quoting as working, and you're saying that there are safeguards there, there has indeed been a steady rise in the number of assisted suicides and requests for assisted suicide in Oregon. That's over 4.5-fold from when they changed their law. So we at the moment have about 20 people a year who will go to Switzerland. But if you take those Oregon figures, you'd be talking about 1,200 people a year, just based on Oregon's figures on a population basis, because it's a small state. It's about half the size of London. What about the safeguards that you propose? You talk about people being terminally ill. Well, I'm afraid as a clinician, I can tell you, we can't really define who is terminally ill. Most conditions in medicine are incurable. Most conditions in medicine are progressive, and we don't know how rapidly they're going to progress. If you're thinking of predicting a prognosis, if you're trying to predict a prognosis of weeks, the margin of error extends into months or years. Even if you think someone's in the last 48 hours of life, you only have about a 97% probability of being right. 3% of those people, when you stop the treatment you were giving them, actually improve because the treatment was doing more harm than the illness, and actually they pick up again. If you want to have an accurate diagnosis, I'm sorry, but medicine is not that good at it. At post-mortem, the Royal College of Pathologists, in evidence to our select committee, told us that about 1 in 20 people at post-mortem are found to have died from a condition that they were not being treated for. I'm afraid diagnosis, again, is a probabilistic art. We do our best, but we don't always get it right. I've had many patients where I have really thought that they were going to be dead in a very short space of time, and I have been completely wrong. Sadly, I've had many patients who I thought would live for quite a time, and I've also been wrong. And I've been struck at how patients actually, when they are themselves ready to die, die. When they've achieved whatever it was as the goal that they set themselves as their last goal in life, they die, and they die peacefully. But we don't hear about those. We hear about a crisis in care in the media. We hear about bad deaths, but you don't hear about all of those people who have good deaths. So it's understandable that a population out there is getting scared about a crisis in care that they're told about. What about other safeguards, though, you propose? You would say that people have to have capacity. Well, I'm afraid you can't assess capacity as a one-off event. You just can't do it. And even Oregon, with a good study, has shown that 1 in 6 of the people who were followed in depth, who went on to end their lives with physician-assisted suicide, actually had an untreated, undiagnosed depression. So in a law where you're saying that people should be referred to psychiatry, the numbers are very low and the number of cases that are missed are huge. What about coercion, the messages that come inside people and externally? Internal coercion, I don't want to be a burden. I don't want to be a financial drain on my family. I think that's an internal pressure which is increasing. But if you have doctors do this, there is also an external pressure, which is if the doctor agrees to do this, then I must be right that my life is not worth living because the doctor agrees that I would be better off dead. Now, that may not be the case. It may be that that doctor just hasn't sought another opinion. And again, if we look at Oregon, the vast majority of doctors don't have anything to do with it. But patients can be referred through the campaigning organisation to doctors who are very happy to write prescriptions. And every year, 1 or 2 doctors are writing a lot of prescriptions, 10, 11, I think 14 was the most in 1 year. So you've got people who are very inclined to write these prescriptions. Their threshold for doing it is much lower than the rest of the population, but they don't know those patients well. And I'm afraid to say, I don't think that we as doctors today know our patients nearly as well as we used to many years ago because continuity of care just isn't there. But last of all, coercion, we don't live in a perfect world. Whilst most parents love their children, not all children love their parents. There are pressures, people looking after someone get carer fatigue. They do get worn out, that's normal, that's part of the human condition. But I want healthcare to keep on striving to improve quality of life and to accept death as the natural close to a life when the person is dying. That's quite different to doctors prescribing a lethal dose to deliberately foreshorten life, sometimes by months, but possibly by years. You just wouldn't know.
Ilora, thank you very, very much indeed. Well, I think you'll agree we've had an absolutely tremendous set of 4 presentations of this discussion now. There's a whole range of issues I noted down as people were speaking, and I'm not really quite sure where to start, but I think where I will begin is, Rob used the word game changer, and Charlie, in your introduction, you were talking about changing an unacceptable state of affairs and bringing the law in line with where the population is. Can I just ask all of you, to what extent is this a game changer? Is it going to change behaviour? People have talked about the Oregon examples and so on. Is it a rather marginal thing which regularises, or is it actually going to change the way in which people behave in significant ways? Charlie, can I ask you just to
I think Rob is completely wrong when he says it's a game changer, because the way that I think the issue is perceived at the moment is that people go to Switzerland to die and there won't be any prosecution in relation to it. The way that the state has operated in relation to this is to say, okay, we're happy with that as a situation. If that is the way that the state is currently operating, and Elora said, surprisingly, in her remarks that she was happy with that position, then I think Rob is talking nonsense when he says the game is going to be changed by a change in the law. She also said, again, I think completely wrongly, that in relation to all laws, they're only enforced if the prosecuting authorities think it's a sort of genuine hard case. That's nonsense. There is only one law where it is habitually not enforced, and that is the law on assisting suicide. On everything else, like, for example, the person who robs because they are hungry, because very, very many people who commit crimes in this country have quite understandable drivers that would make any reasonable person sympathetic. And the way the law operates is that, save in extremely exceptional cases, they will prosecute and let the sentence deal with that. So don't believe her when Ilora says that... I don't know where you're getting this from.
No. Ilora, I'm going to let you come back, but I'm going to ask Giles for his reflection on this discussion. Is it a game changer? Is it not a game changer? Is it important or not?
No, it's not a game changer. I don't think it is a game changer, given what I am interested in with regard to this discussion. And what I'm interested in this discussion is the way in which people care for each other. And I think we're already so far down the route of people thinking that they're just individual, autonomous objects that have rights over their own bodies and they have the right to choose and it's just about them, and this sort of very individualistic thing, that I think this is a natural extension of where we are. And I think that, the 82% of people say the individual has the right to choose how to die. That's where the sort of bulk of the people are with this, and I think that's how they behave and what they're like. So, I mean, I'm completely out of sympathy with that. I have a view which actually the individual doesn't have such an important and prominent place, which is, not a view that's popular at the moment. I believe in communities, and I believe that the important thing is actually people looking after each other and caring for each other. And I think the rights of the individual I'm quite happy to see the rights of the individual suppressed in order for the rights of the community and caring for each other. And I don't think you have a right over your own body.
Ilora, what's your comment on that?
It's a complete game changer. If you look at what's happened in those countries that have changed the law, and it's a small number of countries that have done. Apart from Oregon, look at Holland. Holland was the first country to change its law. The number of deaths by euthanasia, which is where the doctor is injecting or prescribing and supplying physician-assisted suicide, has gone up so that it's now 1 in 37 of all deaths in the country. That would translate to something round about 13,000 a year in the UK. That is a huge change. They don't have specialist palliative care as a distinct specialty. The development of specialist palliative care in other countries just hasn't happened. It isn't there in Oregon. You don't have the training programs that you have here. You don't have the focus on driving up better end-of-life care. You don't have people working full-time. And you will change the tenor of those conversations. I've had many, many patients who have been signed up members of the Voluntary Euthanasia Society, as it was, or currently Dignity in Dying, and who are the ones who are asking time and time again, is there something else you can do? They're frightened of dying. And I've had several who said to me, I never believed I could have such a good quality of life, and have not gone on to pursue a request. I've had open conversations with patients on many occasions about what the motive is, what it is that makes them feel their life is not worth living. And it very often is down to what might seem trivial, but very important things about the individual person, about the care they're receiving. And when you start to say that the doctor agrees that you would be better off dead, you pull back from all of those efforts to improve all those little aspects of life that have amazing improvements in quality of life.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Rob to comment on his own question, then I'll allow Charlie just to respond to the discussion. Rob.
I think there's no doubt that it is a game changer. You've just got to look at the facts. We're talking about something like 20 people a year going to Switzerland. The deaths per year in this country are of the order of 500,000. The number of patients that I look after who talk about assisted suicide or talk about euthanasia is probably about 10%. Those who persist, despite having worked with them and looked at symptoms and actually restoring control to them, falls down to a vanishingly small number. I can count the number of people on two hands, really, over the years who've had specialist palliative care who consistently want to end their lives. But the game changes around this, in my view, and that is the attitudes and perspectives that will start to affect clinicians. And there is good evidence from the psychiatric literature and the psychological literature of the morbidity and effect upon clinicians of being involved in these things. And there's literature's available out there. This is the stuff around game changer in terms of moral hazard, for example. And the really interesting thing, of course, is that once a society changes and makes something legal, it's no longer relevant to, as it were, to investigate it. And that's a big issue. So it's actually all hidden, but there is definitely a change, in my opinion, in my experience, and in my conversations with clinicians in Holland.
Charlie, a quick riposte. I'm then going to go on to another question.
Okay,
but on this question,
Rob said two very interesting things there. First of all, he agreed it was all about the attitude of mind, and I think the Rubicon has been crossed in relation to the way that the state operates in relation to assisted dying at the moment. And I also very much agree with what Rob says. This is not about very many large numbers doing it. In every place where it's happened, it's a small number, exactly the small number of people that Rob identified who, despite every piece of wonderful palliative care they're given, still want to take their own lives. And it's that group of people to whom this law is directed. And if you look at Oregon, it's something like 85 people do it in a year in a population of 3 or 4 million. The question is, and I'm absolutely appalled by what Giles says, because Giles is saying that group of people who might be suffering terrible, they've got to suffer as an example to everybody else so that people care for each other better in the future, which I think is an extraordinary preparation for the church. And the way that you force, and the way that you make people care for each other is by letting them suffer at the end of their lives.
Suffering is a part of life. I mean, that's the whole thing that's so nonsense about your position, is the idea that you can somehow eliminate suffering from life. Suffering is an intrinsic part of human life.
And therefore you've got to go through it, even if there are ways to bring it to an end.
It is what it is to be human. It is what it is to be human. And caring for the human is a part of that.
You're a brute.
Well, I got that. You're right about that.
I'm not going to close the discussion down as I said I was, because almost everybody's bursting out of their chairs to want to say something, so I'll go another round before asking another question. But Rob was first, and then it's Ilona.
I got so excited with what Giles had just said that I forgot the point I was going to make.
Okay.
Do you agree with me or disagree with me?
Of course I agreed with you. But actually, if you are serious, Charlie, about mitigating and removing suffering, you need to focus on people with mental health problems.
I agree with that. These are not exclusive. They're not mutually exclusive.
Thank you. So your intention, therefore, is that this should generally be available for everybody.
So you would like it to be on demand for everybody?
Not on demand.
Or irrespective, so you would actually like it to be for people with mental illness.
No.
So we refocus away.
I understood what Rob was saying to me was
from
to help
chronic
people with mental
illness.
Yes.
From people who have had accidents and have chronic pain, so you'll stop trying to support them to rehabilitate and adapt, which may take years of work with the NHS, during which time they may be suffering in many, many ways, adapting to everything they've lost.
Identify the categories you're asking me about. First of all,
no, I'm asking about people who are suffering because across the whole of society.
Are we talking about everybody suffering or just people with terminal illnesses?
Well, suffering...
I'm only talking about people with terminal illnesses.
Okay, terminal illness is actually pretty easy compared to those people with chronic mental illness.
I'm not suggesting
so you're happy to leave people with severe chronic ongoing illness, suffering and suffering year on year, but just because somebody is almost certainly going to be dead soon, then you'll speed it up and they can be dead quicker. It's not logical.
It is very logical, because what we're talking about here is assisted dying. We're not talking about people, for example, of 25 who are suffering from very severe arthritis. I am not in favour of changing...
So how are you going to draw that line, Charlie?
A judgment by a doctor, just like you make judgments about how you treat... You make it every day of the week, Ilora, because you're making a judgment...
It's a balance of probability.
Yes, I'm happy with that.
I'm going to move it on now. I'm trying to be very polite and courteous.
Keep trying.
As is my style. But I'm going to move on to a very much related question. On this question of the person concerned knowing that they want to die and the issues around. How do we know they know? To what extent is the coercion point, which Elora made earlier on, a serious point, coercion for the family, a sense of duty to the family, a sense of duty to themselves? To what extent are doctors able to make the judgments that we're talking about in this area? To what extent is it possible to get to a yes-no answer as to whether somebody really does want to be assisted to die, and will they, if they can say it today, but will that really be what they want when the moment actually comes? So could we just have a talk around that? It relates to Giles's suffering point, so I'm going to come to you first and then ask the clinician experience just to comment a bit on this, and then give Charlie a bit of a run on it, because it's a big issue. So could you think of your points as ones that Charlie should be thinking about when he responds?
You see, the question of how do you know that you know what you know? Okay. Now, I got a PhD in philosophy, so I apologise, I could go down that route for a very long time, but it is a problem. It is a problem how you know what you think you know you know. And you can say, I know I'm in love with somebody, so I want to get married. Okay, but the nature of that knowing is actually, how did I know? I mean, the reason, let me tell you as a church, the reason you get married in public is because there's no way you can know that you want to do that. Everybody has to hold you to account to do it. Because you have no idea what you've just promised. You'll have no idea what you promised. Because you don't really know that's what you want. You'll never know what you want. The future will almost bear that out. That's why we have to hold you to account because you get married in public. The truth of the matter is you can't know with something like this that you know what you know. It's just that the knowing doesn't work like that. And the idea that I have a burning certainty, and this is just so completely obvious, and that's what makes it true, is actually I have burning certainties about all things all the time, and I'll have them completely differently the next day.
Okay. Elora, what do you think on this?
Well, can I go from the experience of talking to a lot of patients? People fluctuate. People will talk about they want to be dead, they don't want to go on, they wish they could end it all. And some may even attempt suicide themselves and will then later on go on to say how glad that they are still alive, how much meaning their life has, and they could never believe it. And there is this fluctuation that you see actually in most people who become ill that goes between hope and despair, and it's part of the adapting process to illness anyway, and to the change and loss of health and potential loss of life that people are facing. If I can just give you one anecdote story, a patient referred to me with the GP saying, this is the most clear-cut case for euthanasia that I have ever come across. He, a consultant surgeon and a consultant oncologist, all thought this chap would be dead within 3 months, and the patient was absolutely adamant that he wanted assistance to end his life. I thought he would be dead in 3 months as well. Many years later, he says, just don't go there. What would have happened to my kids? Because actually his wife then died. And he ended up as a sole parent by then in a wheelchair, still with his horrible disease ongoing, he's brought these children up fantastically himself. Now, he will talk and has spoken to me very openly about the despair he felt when he thought that he was dying. He had difficult pain. He saw his wife with a new baby and 2 other small children. He didn't want to be a burden to them. He saw everything disintegrating. But his life has huge meaning. But we had to come out the other side.
Thank you. Rob?
You've just seen in the interaction between Charlie and Ilora the difference between a lawyer and a clinician. The lawyers are all about switches on and off, yeses and nos. We're all about maybe, don't really know, let's see how it goes. Because life is like that. The complexities and the sophistications, I can give you lots of examples alongside Ilora's of people whose life has not panned out at all in the way that they expected. And in a sense, I think that I just want to address the coercion question. There is necessarily coercion involved because, let me put this to you, are you seriously going to be wanting to get a doctor to come and assess and evaluate you for assisted suicide who likes doing it? No, you're going to want a doctor who does it reluctantly. The word reluctantly means they're coerced into doing it. And one of our duties, and we can be hung up by the toenails for violating this, is not to do harm to people. And the whole decision about this is where defaults lie. You default to safety all of the time. And one thing I know beyond anything else, having practiced as long as I have, is that I don't know the future. I really don't. And I do not know how somebody's going to change, but I do know that when bad things happen to people, they usually change, and often as not, they change for the good. I'm not suggesting, therefore, that suffering is inherently a good thing. I'm saying that suffering as part of the human condition is the way it is, and generally the older you get, the wiser you become because of all the bad things that have happened along the way. If we truncate that, if we amputate that experience from people, we turn them into robots.
Yes. Exactly right. Charlie, would you like to respond to this
I would.
Quite strong statement of opinion that's coming?
Elora, Giles and Rob are saying these are too difficult. It's too difficult to do. There are 2 bits to it. First of all, do you believe that people are able to come to the conclusion in the context of a terminal illness that having thought about it, having discussed it, they do want to die? The people who go to Switzerland, are they people with a fluctuating view in relation to it? I don't think so. The evidence we got in the Commission for Assisted Dying is that there were a small group of people, no matter how much you gave them excellent palliative care, no matter how much you tried to dissuade them, they would be determined not to go on with the sort of consequences of the particular terminal illness they had. Exactly the group of people that Rob identified. So I think the philosophical nonsense that Giles was talking about, you don't know what you know and you never know when you know what you know what you know. There are people in the world...
Legally speaking.
That's legal. There are people who are capable and keen to reach a conclusion about whether or not they want their life to end in the context of a terminal illness. Wait a minute. And then Rob and Elora's, oh dear, doctors never know what's going to happen, which is what? They're saying nothing is certain. They're obviously right, but as they will both acknowledge in relation to the way that palliative care is delivered, in the way that medicine is delivered, you do have to make decisions from time to time, and generally they will be right. Yes, there may be occasions where they're wrong, but when you're treating a patient, you have to reach some conclusions. And I think it will be a very mighty decision in an individual case. People will be careful about doing it, but we should not step back from this on the basis it's just too difficult. Nobody can make up their own mind, and doctors don't know what's going on. I think that's a completely wrong-headed way of looking at it.
Okay, just before the panel comes back, Linda, you haven't participated in this very much, the first part, other than the overall background. What's your take on these conversations?
I'm still reeling from Giles's revelation that we shouldn't have any individual choice and it's all about capitalism. Giles, we're a democracy. We're a democracy. We have a right to have some input in major decisions that affect us. Isn't it a reasonable extension of that principle rather than some shallow individualistic selfish...
Which is why I actually may end up, if I had to, going to lobbies with Charlie Falconer, and this is what this 82% will no doubt prevail. I'm actually saying that I don't like it. I don't like the world we've become. I don't like where the majority of people are on this issue.
But we want to make you suffer for your own good, so you're just going to...
That's exactly right. That's exactly what you see, I don't think it's about how you die. I think, you know, actually...
It is. It's exactly what
No, I think the death rate in this room is 100%. I mean, I don't know why, but I think there's going to be...
Whether you die,
the question is how you live. The question is how you live. And it's how this affects how you live. And that, for me, is the important question. And the idea that it's simply about the elimination of suffering is very, very dangerous.
I'm going to go to one final...
One little thing. No one talks about an afterlife and whether that actually makes a difference. You know, in a society, in a culture where that has been a very, very important view of you look at your life in a much longer perspective. It's just interesting to throw that in as a
I'm going to ask one other question before throwing it open to the audience, which is, we learnt from today, Linda demonstrated the majority of members of Parliament are not in favour of a change. When we were talking beforehand, the view of Robin and Ilora was that most doctors would not be in favour of a change. Giles is the view that most church leaders would not be in favour of the change. But at the same time, despite these leaders of opinion not favouring change, the vast majority of people faced with the question do favour change. I just wonder if, as a concluding remark before I get questions from the floor, you could all think why it is you think there is this difference between the opinion formers in all these different areas and the people, and whether that difference has any significance. I'll go to Rob first. You've been trying to indicate.
Well, I don't know what perfect world that Charlie lives in, but it's not the one I live in. And what I would say is that I've forgotten what I was going to say there.
It's not a perfect world.
Thank you. And I haven't got a perfect brain. I certainly know that. I mean, the issue for me is that I'm used to looking after people. I see the whole spectrum. And so I am making an informed view on this. Clinicians look after and see dying patients all the time. They don't just hear the stories of people who've witnessed or who've seen other experiences.
And you think that experience is what leads to the difference between...
I think that's a key part of it.
Yes.
I think that doctors have gone into the job to help people to live until they die and look after people whilst they die, not to do it in order that they die. I think that there's a fundamental underlying revulsion amongst clinicians actively to bring about death. And I don't see clinicians weeping into their beer in the pub after work because their patients aren't dead.
Charlie, what do you think about this difference?
In relation to doctors, first of all, there are a group of doctors, of which Elora and Rob are two, who are very opposed to it. There are a group of doctors, and Dr Anne Macpherson is the most distinguished of those who's now died, who is very strongly in favour of allowing assisted suicide. My experience from doing the Commission on Assisted Suicide was that most doctors were in the position where they said, we don't mind whether you say yes or whether you say no to it, oh legislators, but please make your mind up because you're so confused.
Mind. Most of them just didn't mind.
They did not have a strong view one way or the other as to whether or not there should be a law in relation to it, which exactly reflects in a way Elora's view, which is saying the law's okay in the sense you don't criminalise it. So that was very much reflected. They wanted certainty as to what the position was, but there were these two groups, one who was very much in favour of it and one who was very much against it. In relation to the church, I was very struck by those figures, which were some religions, some adherents to religions were quite strongly against it. The Anglican Church and the Roman Catholic Church is very, very against it, but interesting enough, not on moral grounds. They're not saying we'll do it because there's some spiritual reason why you shouldn't do it. They're against it on practical grounds, which I find quite mysterious, because I could understand if you said there were no circumstances in which life could be taken, but that's not the position of the Anglican Church. It's a purely practical one. As far as members of Parliament, MPs are concerned, I've never been an MP, but I would imagine that whether or not you're going to be elected as an MP or not is not going to be dependent on whether or not a few people support you because you support assisted dying, but because organised religion is against it, it's a quite dangerous position to take up. So that, I suspect, is why, first of all, members of Parliament tend to be against it when they state it publicly. And secondly, the Commons has always avoided, for the last 5 years, ever having a debate about it, because people, by and large, as MPs, don't want to take up a position because of the politics of it.
Ilora.
I think that if you, first of all, the House of Commons has debated the subject, but the different bills have been introduced in the Lords, and those of us have said it should be introduced in the Commons, and do not understand why you bring a law back into the Lords, first of all, instead of going to the elected House. But the politicians look at legislation, they're private members' bills, and there's a ballot, and they can go in that. Those responsible for passing legislation look to see whether it is safe to pass the law, and can see when they look at the so-called safeguards that it's too dangerous, you can't define things clearly enough and black and white to make it safe. In terms of the population out there, fear is certainly a major opinion former, and those who go to church and her adherence to religion read the newspapers and watch the media, just like those who don't, and get the same information as they do, and are understandably frightened by the stories that they read. The difficulty is the reality that we are working to provide is not newsworthy. So, for example, you don't hear the number of planes that land safely at Heathrow, but we would hear about one that crashed. If you look at palliative care patients' experience, we've got 4 years data from across the whole of Wales, all specialist palliative care services, all scoring above 9.5 out of 10 on 9 main domains repeatedly. No press interest in that whatsoever. Why? Because it's good care, and it's of course what they should have. And we keep on saying, well, why are we 0.5 down? We should be better for everybody all the time. But you don't get that out there to people who are worrying about what the future lies ahead. And you've got people who are worried well, who are frightened of what may lie ahead as they get older, as they become iller. So I think that's why you've got differences.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take Giles as the last one on this question, and then could people be thinking if they'd like to ask questions, because I'll then come to the audience to take questions there. Giles.
The one thing I imagine the three of us share, that Charlie Falconer, and I'm making an assumption here, so correct me if I'm wrong, perhaps that's not the experience, is we've seen a lot of dying and dead people. A lot of them. And I think we live in a society that's absolutely petrified of death and dying in a way we never really used to be in the same way. I mean, you take a funeral and people will say these days, why, I can't take my children there, it might frighten them, it might upset them, they can't see dead bodies. I'd be very, very interested to do a poll about how many people have actually seen young people. Can I just do it, the young people at the front, how many of you have actually seen a dead body? So there's a very small amount. That would be much higher 50 years ago, be much higher 200 years ago. And the reality is we're afraid of it. We live in all sorts of fictions and we want to get it out of sight and out of mind. And I think what the lawyer wants to do here is put it out of sight and out of mind, because doesn't realise that the reality of death is okay. And it can be faced and it can be borne, and it's okay.
Fine. Okay. Now, I'm going to take questions from the floor, please. I'm probably going to take them in groups of 3.
My name is Sue Radford. I was brought up to believe that the human being was made up of body, mind and spirit. And I guess it touches a little bit on what Linda was asking a little bit earlier. And I think a lot of the debate deals with the body and the mind, which are decaying for whatever reason. But in terms of the spirit, how do you allow the spirit journey to continue? Because the spiritual journey, the soul journey, isn't over until it's over. And I'm sure many people on the panel, especially those Giles and those in palliative care, will have been around people who in their final days have actually had some quite remarkable experiences on this spiritual journey. I saw it with my father, who had dementia, my mother-in-law, who died of terminal cancer. They had remarkable journeys, and which was also a great comfort to those who are left behind. Remarkable comfort. And I just want to sort of throw that element into the debate, especially as it's a faith debate. Thank you.
Yeah, Jonathan Romain. I'd also like to pick up on the religious aspect. And I speak as a rabbi, and also as a rabbi in favour of assisted dying, and part of a new alliance of clergy across all faiths who actually think we can believe in the sanctity of life, but also we don't believe in the sanctity of suffering. Yeah, of course, as Giles says, suffering is part of life, but there's also a duty to lessen it as much as possible. So my question is, isn't it actually rather arrogant to deny that option to those people who are terminally ill and suffering and who wish it? And isn't it the idea of keeping someone else alive so that you can keep your principles intact, isn't that very self-centred?
Jeanette Litton-Cobbold. First of all, it's great to see a panel that doesn't represent the 82%. It's very encouraging, makes me very happy. Secondly, I'm concerned that if this is a very dangerous proposition, and how would you legislate on this? How would you decide who would die? And secondly, how does this promote care within families? How is this helping society at all, as Giles was saying? How does it help community? How does it help us take responsibility for our families?
So who'd like to kick off? Rob?
In respect of the spiritual side of things, what I have found in looking after patients is that patients who believe, think, feel and say the same thing will by and large have a peaceful death. So it's internal conflict that leads to existential crisis. And I've seen every shade of culture and faith face the spectrum of those things. So I think it's about internal coherence. So that's my comment on that. The second thing on the arrogance one, I love this one. I think it's a great one that comes up. If we think it is arrogant, then what on earth are we doing legislating for doctors who don't want to do it, by the way? There's a handful who do, but most of us don't. And expecting us to do it, when actually what we should do is we should have a shelf in Sainsbury's saying taking the following medicine will seriously damage your health, or making gas available or something like that.
They're called cigarettes, aren't they?
So every... No, does it too slowly? Does it too slowly? Does it too slowly? Does it? And it's too uncertain. But you see, that's the problem of clinical care, is it's a bit uncertain. And I'm serious here, is that actually if we genuinely believed that this was a good thing for society, we should just legislate and say this is available, that's where you go get the stuff, and go get the stuff when you want to. To put it behind the laundry of healthcare and somehow make it okay, I think is disingenuous. And I think that's where the arrogance lies, is that society is not willing to take responsibility for itself. It's not willing to take responsibility for its individual death. It's not willing to take responsibility for the collective good, and the fact that actually genuine autonomy and genuine choice is about limitation. And we just need to grow up and understand that this is much more complicated. And that's why I say, what's worse, not to kill people who want to die, or to kill people who might want to live.
Okay, Ilora, then Charlie, then Giles. Ilora.
Well, both Sue and Jeanette's comments made me think of Cicely Saunders' statement, which is that the way a person dies lives on in the memory of those left behind. And certainly the spiritual domain, existential domain of people is an important part of who they are and the way that they respond to their physical and other emotional pressures too. To the rabbi, Jonathan, I would simply say that I'm really worried if you think that doctors, firstly, have to keep someone alive, because that's not the case at all. People can refuse treatment, but we have a duty of care. But we do have to redouble our efforts to relieve suffering, and to fail to provide care and to fail to relieve suffering to the best of your ability, and if you can't, to seek help from others, is actually against our fundamental professional code. The GMC requires us to provide care even when there are no other things that we can and are going to do. I also have a huge worry about the power that doctors already have over patients. Patients believe what we say. I've given you the figures about diagnostic errors. I've told you about the danger. Don't believe us if we give you a prognosis, please, because we'll probably be wrong. But the power of the doctor, most doctors will know that they can persuade a patient into or out of a treatment, because there's a huge knowledge differential about medicine and the way things work. And the reason that we're opposed to this is it is just too dangerous to put this into the hands of doctors and delude yourself into thinking that it would be safe, and delude yourself into thinking that you can safely define only one group of people, because you can't do it.
Thank you. Charlie?
Sue Radford's question, I think the spiritual journey, from my much more limited experience of assisting people and assisting people being with people when they are dying, is incredibly important. And I think it's a dimension that has to be focused on. But both my experience in relation to it and other people who've spoken to me or written about its experiences, that the spiritual journey doesn't necessarily coincide with the physical journey. And the best example I can give of that is a doctor I mentioned before, Dr. Anne Macpherson, whose death was described in very painful detail by her daughter, Dr. Tessa Macpherson, who's a consultant at a hospital somewhere in England. And her mother had pancreatic cancer. She was fine for a few years, and then she got into a phase where it was obvious that she was dying. She went home, or she was at home. She had what her husband described as the best palliative care available. She said goodbye to her family. Everybody agreed that she was going to die in the next 7 to 14 days. And the death that her daughter describes very clinically was absolutely appalling. Now, she makes it clear, Tessa Macpherson, that her mother, Anne Macpherson, had there been a prescription available, she would have taken it. And the spiritual journey that she went on was, for the family, completely ruined by those last few weeks. What Ilora said is so true when she comments on what Cicely Saunders said. The way that people die lives on in the mind of those who live. And do, if you get an opportunity, read Tessa Macpherson's account of the death of her mother. As far as Jonathan Romain's remark is concerned, I must say I had exactly the same reaction as you did, Jonathan, to the sort of wagging your finger and laying down the law and saying you've got to suffer so that society is better as a community. I thought we'd moved on from that. And then Jeanette, how do you decide? Who decides? You're saying, well, at its heart, the person who decides is the person who wants to end their own life. Yes, you need safeguards to ensure that there is no coercion, but ultimately, absolutely key to a proposal about assisted dying is that you have control over your own death.
Thank you. Giles, then I'm going to ask Linda to make a comment, then I'm going to do it for the next round. Giles.
You can't not be moved by the first bit of what Charlie said, not the nonsense he said afterwards, but the first bit that he said about, those people who have indeed very awful deaths and very painful deaths. And that's why, I'm not a fundamentalist on this issue, and there are times when I would imagine taking the draft myself. But what I worry about in a broader sense is that actually Charlie's position is not about me liking suffering, it's actually about wanting to suck up as much reality as possible into life. And I think that I think if you avoid suffering, you hold down other things. With regard to the question of the spiritual journey, and that bit at the end of life, it's very, very interesting that in the Middle Ages, if you'd ask people how they wanted to die, it wouldn't be quietly, quickly, and in your sleep. It would actually be take a bit of time. And the reason it needed to take a bit of time is because they needed to say goodbye to their families, they needed to say goodbye to their enemies, they needed to make peace with the world and themselves, and they need to prepare themselves for death. We almost want to do it without noticing, without knowing that it's happening. And that's a part of the reality that I think we're not sucking up into broader human life, that actually we are mortal and that we die. And I think we are in a game of let's pretend, of which assisted dying is a part of that let's pretend, which doesn't suck up as much of the reality of human life as I think we ought to. It's not that I value suffering, it's that I value human beings, and human beings suffer.
Thank you. Linda.
I think people changing attitudes towards suffering is a very important shift. So suffering was, you're being quite traditional in this, suffering did used to be seen as a good. I can remember interviewing older ladies when I started my job, and they would often tell you about something awful in life, and they'd say, well, we're put on this earth to suffer. And it was seen as, yeah, a positive thing. Do you really think that, Giles? Most people don't think that anymore. And if so, I mean, give an example, you know, from your own pastoral experience of how someone going through something awful that they really didn't want to feel, or pain, you know, what does it give? What is the positive that you get out of that?
Well, let's talk about something that's completely different to this. Let's talk about emotional pain. Okay, let's talk about...
No,
but you're...
question.
How
does suffering actually... Why is it a good thing? Why is it a good thing? And what are those positive benefits that you're talking about?
It is entirely bound up with what it is to be human. It's entirely bound up. So if you actually repress... I don't think the suffering is good in and of itself.
No, but give an example of how it helps.
But if human beings have that about them, it's like, for instance, falling in love. Okay, I think personally falling in love is much more suffering than it is to do with happiness. Personally, that's maybe my experience or not. But actually, with the idea that you might want to get rid of the suffering is absolutely ridiculous, because falling in love is the most wonderful thing in the world. So a part of being a human being is to suffer, and that's the nature of our lives. And to hold it down is to repress something fundamentally important about who we are.
My name is Mevish, Miss Chowdhury. So just referring to a comment that you made earlier on about desensitizing ourselves to suffering and pain, I wanted to ask that, would you then argue that due to the possibility that we will maybe have a horrible death and, you know, we suffer a lot in life, do you think that gives meaning to the terms quality of life? Do you think only because of that can we then appreciate other things?
Thank you. I'm Peter Stevenson from the Elephant and Castle. My question is one of timing, and I wonder if the panel would reflect with me why this debate has come up at this time, and whether there are other things that are impacting this debate, maybe financial.
Yes, Elizabeth Oldfield from Theos. This is another question for Charles Faulkner, and forgive me, I realise a lot of them are coming your way, but it's a very practical question really about your proposals. I'd love to hear if you do indeed want to limit this ability to doctors, and if you do, whether that's because there's a kind of regulation there and professional codes and a lower risk of criminal behaviour. And if you do want to limit that, the right and the freedom from prosecution to doctors, what you then do with the conscientious objections of, sounds like not just religious believers, but quite a large swathe of doctors. I'd love to hear kind of how practically you think you deal with that.
Okay, thank you.
My name is Maureen Murphy. That says it all. I'm a church-going Catholic. But I'd like to ask Charles, really. He does make me very worried that once the floodgates are open, there'll be no stopping them. It's just like the abortion bill, when it was meant to be 2 doctors for not very good reasons, apparently. But now it seems to me as if it's an abortion on demand. So I think the same thing would happen with the euthanasia bill.
My name's Judith Nietzschel. My question is, if there were more geriatricians on the panel rather than palliative care specialists, whether we might have a slightly different slant to the debate, because my impression, having worked in the health service, is that geriatricians are very often giving just slightly more morphine than the old person needs. And that is a compassionate act. I don't know how this fits in with the legislation, but it's just a point I want to put into the debate.
I'm Harry Rushworth. I'd just like to say, where would you draw the line, and would there be a difference in policy between assisted dying and assisted suicide? For in one case you may say that with assisted dying people are more likely to die anyway, but with assisted suicide, surely they're going to have more suffering long term for themselves?
It's Bjarne, and it's very much in line with the last question. And also to Charlie, as he's known, there's the Nicholson and the Lamb cases, where they're trying to change the law. But there's also those who are fearing of their quality of life and losing their mental capabilities, like Terry Pratchett. So where will you put those in the brackets?
Judith Richardson.
Yes, thank you.
I'm interested to know how doctors in Switzerland have adjusted to the work they do and why our medical profession would find it so difficult.
Wes Sutton, Lord Falconer, you said that you thought that the law should catch up with what people are doing. Are you sure that's an entirely wise strategy? Because many of us would not want to pay our taxes.
Thank you for all those questions. In Switzerland, it's a very, very small number of doctors involved, just to dispense with that one. In terms of double effect, which somebody was talking about, the intention is completely different. If you intend to relieve a symptom or suffering, you will titrate up the dose of drug. You may get side effects. You may begin to get into the zone of toxicity. If you're heavily into that, you will drop the dose back. So people may have sedative side effects. That's fundamentally different to the intention to end their life when you give them a massive overdose as a one-off. I think the whole argument is encapsulated in the story of the policeman's dilemma. A truck driver driving down the road in the States had a crash in the middle of nowhere, in a petrol tanker, trapped in the cab. A policeman came by and the cab driver said, "There's petrol dripping on the engine. Please shoot me. I do not want to burn to death." What would you do? It was a question posed to the select committee I was on. One person given evidence said, "I would shoot him, but I wouldn't change the law to allow it." And I think that's exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about the fact that there will always be people who commit suicide, sadly, in society. There will always be some people who have assisted somebody out of compassion, out of the best of motives. But we're saying it is too dangerous to change the law to make this part of clinical practice as part of the therapeutic offering.
Thank you. Giles, what would you like to answer from those
I think
questions?
that's, I want to say what a brilliant answer I thought that was. I think that's absolutely right.
Thank you, Giles.
I think that's just, I just wanted to say...
That's really nice.
No, I'm sorry, that wasn't, I was trying to patronise you. I'm sorry, I didn't really mean that way. I think it was just absolutely completely bang on. I just
this looks like the love you were talking about.
Absolutely brilliant. That's absolutely right. Of course, you want to try and rescue the person too. I mean, you might want to rescue the person, but I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think what we're faced with here is a sense that there is so much complexity that a survey, and I am disturbed by the survey that we had, there's so much complexity that a neat survey really can't access. And when you actually talk to people who are actually professionally involved and see the complexity, and I think if actually people did that, they'd realise that what's being proposed here is really very dangerous indeed. And I know Charlie Fortner wants the world to be nice and neat and thinks it's all terribly easy and ordered and there aren't any confusing, complex issues here. There really bloody well are. And that's what we're going to get into.
Charlie, do you want to respond on the... by the way, on other questions?
Ilora and Giles, and I will come to some of the questions in a moment, but ask yourself the current question, which is what Ilora and Giles are in favour of is a completely unregulated situation, where there is a law which is not enforced. The alternative is to have a situation, and people go off to Switzerland and commit suicide. We don't know whether or not they're being coerced into it. We don't know the pressures on them. We don't know because there is no diagnosis to whether they're terminally ill or not. And that's the current position. The arguments against, which Ilora and others are advancing, are about practicality. So the question for the law is, do we try and make it as safe as possible, avoid people being coerced, avoid people going to Switzerland when perhaps they're not terminally ill when they believe they are? I am sure that it is far better to try to do it in an ordered way. Of course, mistakes will be made because I recognise that we don't live in a perfect world, and it must be better than the current arrangements. Among the questions that we were asked is, why is it now? Somebody's asked me about the timing of it. And I think the reason why the timing is occurring is not just happening now. It's been happening over a long period of time as more and more people have attracted publicity, not through any choice of theirs, about going to Switzerland. And it is a subject that is of real interest to the people because people generally feel the law is out of line with the right experience. The practical safeguards we were asked about, the choice is you have a court say it's okay, or you have doctors who are engaged in the treatment of the patient, plus maybe an independent doctor. And it seems to us that the best method of dealing with that is that you have doctors engaged who are much more directly connected with the thing. Maureen Murphy, who said her name said it all, it didn't say anything at all, I thought. You were worried about the floodgates. If you have proper safeguards and you compare what's happened in other countries, in particular Oregon, there are numbers. The numbers of people who will take their own lives will go up because it will become more possible to do. But the numbers in Oregon, as I've said, are about 85 or 86 a year. And it is something that, if it comes into law, will be something regarded as a very serious step before it can happen. So I don't believe that you should be worried about the floodgates. The final question, the gentleman over there, who asked, am I in favour of suicide or assisted dying? If by what you mean by assisted suicide, as Linda defined it at the beginning, was helping people who aren't going to die anyway, no, I am not. I think society should do all that it can to stop people who are not about to die from committing suicide. But I recognise that if you are in a terminally ill situation, maybe with only a few weeks to live, like Dr. Anne McPherson, it is the right and compassionate thing for that person to conclude he or she wants to do. And I am incredibly keen that if people come to that rational decision, they should be helped to do it, not forced to go to Switzerland.
Thank you. Rob, could you just also, in your answer, Rob, deal with the question about geriatricians, yes, and the point that was made by the lady there?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, just a couple of things I want to comment on. Let me just deal with the geriatric. I mean, British Geriatric Society has the only group that's against assisted suicide more than the British Geriatric Society is palliative medicine. So it's something like 85 towards between 85 and 90%. And so that deals with that. The second thing is the evidence, the hard evidence, the empirical evidence shows very clearly that morphine does not kill people if it's prescribed properly. And actually the leeway for making mistakes is far greater in morphine than it is with a whole load of other drugs, prominent amongst which is insulin. Insulin's a lethal drug that's used all the time. So that hopefully deals with that. I think I just want to deal with the suffering case. So give me an example of suffering. I could give lots of examples where people have broken through to a new place which they wouldn't have got to unless they had to face something and it actually had physical form. But there's again, I want to stick with something scientific here. There's an interesting case of something called congenital anesthesia, the inability congenitally to experience pain. A patient had this, and she was covered in burns and all sorts of things, an ulceration, because she didn't know that she was being burnt. She presented with uncontrollable pain. She didn't have the neurology to sense pain, yet she had pain. And it turns out that it was to do with emotional difficulty and relational problems. They dealt with the emotional and relational problems and her pain went away. The point I'm making is that thresholds of symptoms are very good barometers of what's going on internally. And to think that it's a simple physical thing or somehow that people know what's going on for themselves simply isn't true, because a lot of emotional things that lead to behaviours and distress and problems is so deeply buried that the only way it gets out often is by expressing itself with some kind of symptom. And one of our jobs is to try and help someone to dig around and find that. Going on to the limitations, I think we have to understand that in Holland, they are looking very actively now at legislation for people ending their life because they're tired of life. Yeah. And they've already legislated for euthanasia in children. These are people who do not have legal capacity. So the proposition, and they've been managing people with euthanasia with intractable depression and with dementia for quite some considerable time. So the idea that this is not going to bleed into a general proposition that there's a best interest call, we don't want somebody to suffer because I think I see them suffering but they can't tell me back that they are, I don't think that's true. If we consider suffering tired of life, fine. Well, let's just make it available, full stop, and let's not clutter it with medicine. Let's be real and take ownership of the responsibility we have in society. Suffering is bad. I totally agree with that. I spend my whole life trying to mitigate it. That's what I do every day. Gets me up in the morning. But do you know what? I think killing people thinking that you're going to solve the problem of suffering is worse. And I'll tell you why. Because as Charlie's just said, you can't get it right all the time. There are going to be mistakes. Now, I guess Charlie needs to answer the question, is it okay for me to have my life ended against my wishes because I can't communicate it but don't want it to happen in order that other people can have that freedom, that entitlement? Sorry, not freedom. They've
Against
already
your wishes?
The freedom of suicide.
Against your wishes, what do you mean? We're talking about assisted dying.
Let's say, for example, you were incapacitated insofar as you couldn't communicate your wishes. Yeah. But actually inside, your internal reality, you were very clear that actually you had some more living to do. Yeah. And everybody looked at you, and because you were trying to communicating this stuff and you couldn't speak properly and you had dysfunction and you appeared to grimace when you were actually experiencing and expressing pleasure and all those kinds of things, and everybody was looking at you like my mum looked at my dad and said, I can't bear this dreadful suffering. And I remember him talking about this way back when, and he said if ever this happens, he wants his life ended. And you're sitting there grimacing away saying, oh, don't do that. Because the goalposts have moved, because you don't know what...
suggesting that you
hold on.
I'm not sure what you're getting at.
Because your future... You don't know...
This is what you're hoping... Some law in the future we're not talking about.
If the law is there, for sure, people will take a best interest decision. Because if clinicians are involved, they will do it.
I don't want to have a direct dialogue. I'm going to come to Linda. Any final comments, not questions, on the discussion that you'd like to put forward?
One thing that's really struck me from the survey and the debate, actually, is that the people who want to see a change in the law are doing so on a very principled ground. And yet, I mean, the debate here, those who are against, it's more pragmatic than principled, I think. Not Giles, because you think suffering's good, that's your principle. So it does seem to be a debate...
No questions, no provocations, just speak
the principle that would have been on the other side, which was sanctity of life, we saw that in the abortion debate and the survey results, we've seen it here, that is less convincing to people, but there are very real I'm not saying pragmatic's bad, I'm saying I've heard from this, there are very real practical and pragmatic problems which people feel they need to overcome and they worry about the vulnerability. But that's not so much a principled objection. The principle seems to be on the side of those like Charlie who want to see a change in the law.
At which point, that's a very good provocation. I'm afraid we've come to the end of time, so we have to wind it up. And so I've got a few thank yous, first of all. First of all, I really want to thank the panel. I'm acutely aware what an impassioned discussion this is. And I want to thank you for keeping the conversation both very, very clear for people, which I think has really been excellent, and you've expressed your positions very honestly and very directly, all of you, and for keeping also yourselves under a degree of control. I thought for a moment or two that wasn't going to be the case, but in fact you did, and I really appreciate it. So can we all express our appreciation to the panel?